Jon Snow gazed across the dark waters of the Trident, the chill of late autumn clinging to his cloak as though the cold itself had become part of him. He had always been cold. He was Ned Stark's bastard, after all. That was how men saw him. But tonight, the eyes that followed him were more keen. He was no longer a nameless, inconsequential figure of the North. Instead, he was suddenly poised to be a key piece in the great game of houses and lords, of alliances and betrayals. Word had come from Robb Stark that a bride was needed to secure passage across the Green Fork. Lord Walder Frey's price had been high and typically humiliating. He would not just let Robb pass and repass as he pleased. He required a marriage into the Stark bloodline, some union to tie the honor of Winterfell to the ancient if unloved house of Frey. But matters grew complicated when Robb broke his promise by wedding another. His heart had led him astray, and he had made Talisa Maegor his queen in the north. The old Lord Frey would not forgive such an affront, for any number of honeyed words or empty promises. War brewed. The young wolf was strong, but not strong enough to storm the twins, and not cunning enough to quell Lord Walder's fury. Lady Cailin Stark had worked tirelessly to salvage the situation. In her desperation, she had pleaded with her son. His vow was broken. Lord Frey would not take him back as a son-in-law. But there was another option if only Walder Frey could be placated. A Stark by blood, though born on the wrong side of the sheets, might yet serve as suitable payment for the crossing and the continued loyalty of House Frey. Cailin had not spoken it aloud in so many words, but everyone at Riverrun knew who she meant: Jon Snow. Even the mention of the boy had set tensions to a simmer. Catelyn Stark had never cared for her husband's bastard, tolerated him, perhaps, though never with warmth. But the times were desperate. Desperation called for desperate remedies. And so a rider had been sent to the wall, carrying an offer and a royal command. They had needed the Lord Commander's assent to release the young man from his vows. A tricky matter, but not without precedent should the realm's need be great. And though Jon had already pledged himself to the Night's Watch, war had a way of twisting old oaths to suit necessity. And so Jon Snow had come from the wall, his black cloak traded for a simpler garb of gray wool that bore the direwolf sigil in subtle detail. He felt the eyes of men and women alike upon him as he stood before the gates of the Twins, where Walder Frey's brood was gathered. The great doors of the fortress parted, the Twins looming tall and ominous, sentinels of stone that spanned the river crossing. Lord Walder received them in the grand hall, where too many Freys to count had assembled. They were an ill-favored bunch, pale, watery eyes, large ears, faces that seemed to sag like dough left to grow cold. The old man himself sat hunched in a high-backed chair, peering at Jon as though he were scrutinizing a horse he might purchase. The silence pressed upon the hall when Robb and Cailin turned to present Jon, explaining in careful terms how the match might be arranged, how he might be legitimized if the king in the north so decreed. "You're Ned Stark's bastard, eh?" Walder Frey rasped at last. Spittle flecked the corners of his mouth. "Heard you took the black. You may not wear the black now, but that vow is for life. Unless your brother, the king, can wave his hand and proclaim, 'Never mind?' I suppose these days, kings can do as they please." Jon swallowed, recalling Maester Aemon's quiet acceptance when the letter had come from the king in the north. He had expected it to be refused. But old Aemon had said something about how love is the bane of honor, and how duty is as heavy as a mountain. In the end, the letter had declared that the realm was in dire need of peace between the North and the Freys, that a life was spared if one vow could be set aside by the High Septon and by the authority of the King of the North. And so Jon Snow was free to become a hostage to Walder Frey's peace, or so it felt to him. "I am," Jon answered softly, "Lord Walder. I am Ned Stark's son by blood, and I have come to offer my hand in marriage to one of your granddaughters, if you will have me. My lord brother, King Robb, is prepared to grant me the name Stark, if that's what pleases you." Lord Walder's expression was sour, cunning, and triumphant all at once. He looked at Jon, then let his gaze flick to the rest of his brood. "Humph. So the king breaks his oath, and in recompense, I get a bastard, albeit a legitimized one. if the word of a teenage king can indeed legitimize him. Are all Starks so liberal with vows? Robb's shoulders tensed, but Cailin laid a hand on her son's wrist. Now was not the time to provoke. They needed this man, this crossing, for the war to continue. "Lord Walder," Cailin said in the calm, gracious tone that once would have charmed the lords of the Trident, "we have come to you in good faith, to show that the bond between our houses can still hold true." Quite so, Walder Frey said with a dismissive gesture. He peered at Jon again. "Bastard or no, you have the Stark look about you. I never liked your father, but at least he was an honorable sort. My dear granddaughter Roslin has some claim to beauty. Would you like to see her? Or shall I produce a litter of Frey girls, and you pick one to your liking?" Jon stiffened at the old man's mockery. He had prepared himself for humiliation. He forced the words out, each tasting of iron. "I will do my duty to my king and my family, my lord," he said. "If Roslin is the bride you have chosen for me, I should be grateful to make her my wife. I've heard she is gentle, kind, and fair." Walder Frey's beady eyes sparkled a bit at the compliment paid to Roslin. Perhaps genuine affection flickered in the old man's heart, or perhaps he was merely calculating how best to bind a child of Ned Stark to his brood. "My precious Roslin," he said, voice oily. Yes, she is quite sweet, but tears too often for my liking. Still, tears or no, she'll produce strong heirs if you do your husbandly duty. But can you produce heirs? Snow?" He cackled, and some of the Freys tittered behind their hands. "Not that you'd have the first clue about it, having spent your days up at the wall with the crows." Jon felt his cheeks burn, but said nothing. His vow of chastity for the Watch was moot now, forcibly undone by the politics of war. Still, the presence of so many leering, mocking Freys made him feel as if he stood on a rickety scaffold. Across the hall, he glimpsed Roslin Frey for the first time, peeking out timidly from behind a Septa's robe, eyes lowering the moment he met her gaze. She was indeed fair, with delicate features and soft brown hair. She looked frightened or perhaps sorrowful. He could only guess which. Walder Frey gave a satisfied grunt. "Well, we shall have the wedding soon. I will not endure another broken vow, so we'll do this quickly. Let us say 2 days hence. You're not a king, so your bedding will be a simpler affair, but I shall see it done properly. And after the bedding, we'll discuss how best to ensure that the crossing remains open, and how my men might aid your precious king in the north." The next 2 days passed in a haze for Jon Snow. He had never imagined himself in this position, forced into a marriage for the sake of war, parted from the Night's Watch by the decrees of lords and kings, no longer able to call himself a brother in black. He felt rootless, uncertain. At least at the Wall, his identity had been defined by solemn duty. Now he was to be a Stark again, or was he still only a piece on the board, moved by others? He saw little of Roslin during that time, only glimpses when Walder summoned him to dine. She never spoke much, only bowed her head, offered him a shy, fearful smile, and let others speak on her behalf. Now and then, one of her siblings would taunt her or jostle her in the hall, and Jon would catch sight of tears in her eyes. It stirred a protectiveness in him he did not fully understand. She was sweet, gentle, perhaps too meek for the rough edges of his own life. He had known Ygritte, kissed by fire, a spear wife whose boldness rivaled any man. Roslin Frey seemed the opposite, gentle as a frightened bird. But the memory of Ygritte was too raw, too close to the heart, and he forced himself not to think of her. Ygritte was in his past. Duty was all he had now. On the day of the wedding, Lord Walder Frey spared little expense, in typical Frey fashion. The twins bustled with music, flagons of ale, over-salted stew, and the sharp tang of roasted meats. Yet the mood was unsettled. The memory of Robb Stark's broken oath hung over every cup, every tune the musicians played. Frey eyes followed every movement of the Starks, as though waiting for some sign of further betrayal. Robb stood at Jon's side, proud in his bearing as the king in the north. Perhaps he felt some guilt for forcing his half-brother into a vow that had never been meant for him. If so, Robb concealed it behind a mask of regal determination. The ceremony in the small sept was brief and blunt, overshadowed by the presence of Walder Frey, who loomed in his seat, flanked by the many children and grandchildren of his line. Roslin was brought forth, draped in a pale blue gown that accentuated her delicate features. A maiden's cloak was lifted from her slender shoulders, and Jon stood with a solemn face, taking his father's gray and white cloak to drape over her. He had never in his life expected to perform such an act, to cloak a bride of House Frey with the direwolf of the Starks. For a moment, he imagined his father's disapproval, and then realized that Ned Stark would have done anything to protect the North, and would not begrudge a necessary marriage. When their hands were bound by the ribbon in the colors of House Stark and House Frey, Jon felt the tremor in Roslin's fingers. She dared to look at him, only once, and in those soft brown eyes he thought he glimpsed a question. "Are you cruel, too? Will you be kind?" He tried to let his eyes convey something gentle, something that might ease her heart. He did not know if it succeeded. They said their vows. They did the customary steps. And then the Septon declared them man and wife. The High Lords gathered had no time for lengthy cheers. Soon after, wine was poured, and the wedding feast began, overshadowed by the tension that forever seemed to envelop any gathering of Freys. Jon found himself at the high table, seated next to his bride, trying to make polite conversation while men eyed him with suspicion or condescension. Robb rose to propose a toast. He spoke in that honest, straightforward voice he had. "My lords, we come together on this day to see my brother wed to Lady Roslin Frey. Let us all pray the union is blessed with harmony, and that it stands as a bond unbroken between our houses. May the gods be witness to this new promise, and may it bring our houses closer as the storms of war rage outside these walls." The crowd murmured, lifted cups, and drank. Jon felt the wine on his tongue, heavy and sweet, as he glanced sidelong at Roslin. She sipped from her own cup, eyes on the table. He asked if she needed anything. She shook her head and spoke so softly, he almost did not hear her. "I am well, my lord." He wanted to tell her not to call him my lord. He was only Jon. But the hall was loud, and the eyes were many, so he let it pass. He had never enjoyed feasts, so he struggled through each course, accepting compliments from Frey uncles he could not tell apart, ignoring the watchful glances of Robb's bannermen who had come with him. Now and then, Walder Frey would glance at them with a sneer that might have been amusement. Then came the bedding. Jon's heart hammered, though not with excitement or lust, rather with dread of the spectacle the Freys would make of it. He saw Roslin's knuckles go white as she clutched the table. He bent close to her ear, murmuring, "I'll make sure no harm comes to you. This is but their way, but I will do what I can to spare you any offense." She looked up at him gratefully, tears threatening to spill over. And then the men and women descended, dividing them. Hands pawed and pulled at their clothes, jostling them amidst a chorus of bawdy jokes. Jon clenched his jaw. He felt rough hands ripping at his doublet, as Roslin was ushered away through a different door, her cheeks burning with shame. At last, bruised and disheveled, he was pushed into a small bedchamber lit by flickering candles. Roslin stood by the bed, trembling in her shift. She looked frail, frightened, and he could see the tear tracks glistening on her cheeks. He closed the door behind him, shutting out the drunken laughter of those who lingered outside. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, with careful steps, he approached her, took her hand gently in his. "We don't have to do anything tonight that you don't want," he whispered. "I know what it is to be forced into something." She looked at him, startled. A faint spark of relief flickered in her dark eyes. Then fresh tears welled up. "My lord," she began, but her voice quavered too much. She drew in a shaking breath. I understand that we must." She did not finish. Jon raised his other hand, cupping her cheek. "We are husband and wife now, but that does not mean I will ever hurt you," he said quietly. "I will do my duty, but let us do it gently, and only if you are ready." She bit her lip and nodded. "Thank you," she whispered, so softly he almost did not hear. They extinguished most of the candles, leaving only a small flame for light. Jon moved slowly. He remembered the first time he had lain with Ygritte, how awkward it had been, how uncertain he had felt. Yet this was different. Here there was no sense of stolen love in a cave behind a waterfall. This was a political arrangement, and yet he could not help but feel sympathy, even tenderness, for the trembling girl. Gently, carefully, they began to do what was expected of them as man and wife, though each step felt stilted, overshadowed by fear. He tried to be kind, to let her set the pace, to reassure her. When at last their union was consummated, Roslin clung to him, weeping, though her tears were quiet. When morning came, and the first pale light of dawn shone through the chamber's window, Jon found Roslin asleep at his side, her face looking more serene than he had seen before. He slipped from the bed carefully, not wanting to wake her, pulling on a simple robe. Part of him yearned for the crisp air of the north or the empty vantage of the wall. Here, he felt as though he were wrapped in webs, with Walder Frey and his brood perched at the center. Outside, the twins soared on either side of the water. Jon gazed upon the muddy banks where the men of House Frey kept watch, and the banners that bore the sigil of 2 stone towers on gray and blue. He felt an uneasy stirring in his gut. He had saved Robb from what might have been a disastrous feud with Walder Frey. Had it truly saved them, or just delayed the inevitable? Old Walder was cunning, vindictive, and vain. Jon had no illusions that the marriage alone would endear him to the Freys, but at least it kept the lines of alliance open. In the following days, a more formal arrangement was reached. The assembled lords of the North and the Riverlands convened in the hall with Walder Frey, who wore a smug expression. Robb Stark proclaimed, in front of them all, that he would petition the Great Council or the High Septon. Once King's Landing was retaken, or once the war found some sense of lawful resolution, to formally legitimize Jon Snow, granting him the name Stark. Until such time as that was possible, Jon would act as an emissary of the king in the north, allied to House Frey by marriage. Walder Frey pretended to hum and haw, as though unimpressed, but everyone in the hall knew that he was pleased. He had wanted a close tie to the Starks. Even if Jon was still technically a bastard, the official word of the king in the north stood for something. The old man smirked at Robb, at Cailin, and at Jon. "Very well," he said. "We shall see how this plays out. But my men will march with you, your grace, for now. And my gates will remain open, so long as you remain true to your word." He cast a long, meaningful look at Roslin, who sat quietly to one side. Jon felt a swell of anger, but kept his face neutral. He knew he was bound to these people now, whether he liked it or not. He forced himself to speak. "You have my word, my lord. I will not shame House Frey." When the negotiations concluded, the fires in the great hall burned low. The men parted ways, some to stable their horses, others to eat and drink. Jon asked quietly after Roslin, who had slipped away once the talk of troop movements and territories began. He found her in the small sept, kneeling at the altar of the Seven, her head bowed in prayer. She did not hear him enter. He watched her for a moment, standing in the doorway, uncertain. He had never known how to pray to the Seven. His father had taught him the old gods of the north. The weirwood, the silent forest, that was what spoke to him. But Roslin's shoulders shook. He heard a quiet sob escape her lips. He took a careful step forward, then another until he knelt beside her. She flinched at first, turning her tear-stained face toward him, startled, but her expression softened when she recognized him. "Forgive me," she whispered, wiping her cheeks. "I am not accustomed to so many changes. I prayed for guidance, for forgiveness if I have in any way displeased you." Jon's heart twisted. "You haven't displeased me," he said softly. "You've done nothing wrong. This marriage was forced on both of us, Roslin. Neither of us asked for it. But I swear to you, I'll never treat you unkindly. If you wish to remain here at the Twins, I'll speak to Lord Walder and my brother. If you'd rather come north with me, I suppose I'll be going wherever Robb needs me. but I'll do my best to keep you safe. That is the only promise I can give." She looked down at her hands, twisting them in her lap. "I'm your wife," she said, her voice trembling less than before. "My place is with you, wherever you go. I am afraid, but I know my duty." A faint attempt at a smile ghosted across her lips. "If you can promise me just a little kindness, I will do my duty gladly." Jon gently laid a hand over hers. "Then I promise it." That was how it began. For a time, it seemed as though the alliance had a chance to hold. Robb Stark set off again to continue his battles against the Lannisters. His host swelled with several thousand Frey soldiers, commanded by two of Lord Walder's elder sons, Ryman and Edwin. Jon and Roslin accompanied the host, riding near the center of the column. It felt strange for Jon to ride beside Robb, who was a king now, a crown of bronze and iron across his head. They had grown up together, once upon a time, but now the roads of fate had changed them both. Caitlin Stark watched Jon with wary eyes at first, still uncertain about whether he was truly loyal to Robb or to himself. But in the weeks following the wedding, she softened somewhat. She saw that Jon treated Roslin gently, that he did not brag or swagger, and that he carried out Robb's orders with all the seriousness of a sworn brother. An irony, considering the vow he had left behind. Roslin herself began to open up a little. She would speak quietly with Jon during the marches, and he learned that she loved music above all things, that she had wept at the idea of leaving her old sept behind, that she had always dreamed of a kinder world than the one her family inhabited. Once, she admitted that she had dreaded the idea of marrying a Stark after hearing how Lord Walder cursed them for breaking oaths. "But you are not like how I imagined," she told Jon hesitantly, her brown eyes studying him. "How did you imagine me?" Jon asked, a slight grin tugging at his lips. She blushed. Cold, fierce, a warrior who would care only for his sword. Jon let out a low sigh. "I suppose I am cold sometimes," he said. "The wall was cold. My life was cold. But that does not mean I want to be that way. If you can help me find a bit of warmth, I'd be grateful." Roslin's smile was shy, yet genuine, a ray of sunlight in the gloom of war. She reached out and touched his hand. "Then I will try." So they pressed on, deeper into the war-torn riverlands. Smoke rose from distant fields, the stench of burning crops and slaughtered livestock haunting the roads. Jon felt uneasy. He had fought wildlings, whites, and other threats beyond the wall. But war in the south was a different kind of horror, a slow and merciless erosion of peace. Villages lay in ruins, the small folk scurrying like frightened rabbits whenever a host approached. Robb had no illusions. He led the army with grim determination, planning to strike again at the Lannisters or to reclaim territory lost in the last conflict. He counted on Walder Frey's men to bolster his forces, trusting that the new marriage bond would ensure Frey loyalty. From time to time, Walder's sons, Ryman and Edwin, cast Jon suspicious glances, as if they resented that a bastard was now married to one of the sweetest Frey daughters. But they followed orders, mindful of their father's commands. Then came a letter from Roose Bolton at Harrenhal, urging caution. King's Landing still reeled from the War of the Five Kings, but Tywin Lannister was rumored to be on the march again. The North was under threat from Ironborn raids along the coast. The war was turning more complex by the day, and Robb's leadership was tested like never before. Through it all, Jon stayed by his half-brother's side, doing what he could to offer counsel and direct men in small skirmishes. Months passed. Jon and Roslin learned to share a tent on the campaign trail. Gradually, the initial awkwardness gave way to a quieter sort of companionship. She embroidered small patches for his torn cloaks. He taught her how to handle a dagger, insisting she at least know the basics to protect herself. She was timid but took his lessons to heart. Sometimes at night, he would wake to find her curled against him, seeking warmth in the chill autumn air. He would lie there, staring at the tent's canvas roof, listening to the distant howls of wolves in the forest, feeling something bloom inside him that he dared to call affection. Not the fiery passion he'd once felt beyond the wall, but a gentler, growing bond. One day, as they marched through a valley near the Blue Fork, Robb received a raven bearing dire news. The letter bore the seal of the Eyrie. Lady Lisa Arryn announced that she would remain out of the war, barricaded behind her mountain stronghold, refusing to aid the Starks in any significant way. Another letter came from the crumbling castle of Moat Cailin, where a small group of Ironborn had entrenched themselves, blocking the way back to the north. Robb cursed. He needed safe passage to the north, but now the Ironborn threatened that route. "I must go north," he told Jon, his eyes dark with worry. "My men grow weary, and the Lannisters gain ground with every day we tarry in the south. If I lose the north, I lose everything." Jon understood. He also saw how Roslin's expression grew worried whenever talk of returning to the twins arose. She had not admitted it openly, but Jon suspected she did not wish to return home. Too many memories of living under Walder Frey's shadow. In truth, Jon did not relish returning there either. He needed to see the north again, to stand beneath the weirwood in Winterfell's godswood and remember who he was, or who he might become if the gods permitted. So the decision was made. Robb would lead the bulk of his forces north, retake Moat Cailin, and then push out the Ironborn. The Frey forces under Ryman and Edwin were to follow his banner. Yet certain voices among the Freys whispered that it was not their duty to go so far north. Some recalled the ancient grudges from the time of the River Kings. Others muttered that Walder Frey had made no vow to fight the Ironborn, only to keep the peace with the Starks. A letter from Walder arrived soon afterward, instructing his sons to remain in the Riverlands, to protect the twins from any potential Lannister incursion. He had, after all, provided men to aid in Robb's earlier campaigns. Now he judged that Robb's sense of gratitude should suffice. Robb seethed with frustration, but there was little he could do. The letter from Walder Frey was polite yet firm, reminding the king in the north that the marriage alliance was not a dog's leash to be pulled at will. At least Walder promised not to bar Robb's return across the twins, which alleviated some fear. Jon realized how precarious this alliance still was. There was no true friendship or love lost between the Freys and the Starks, only duty and politics. Still, because of Jon's marriage to Roslin, Walder did not dare openly betray them. He had the comfort of knowing one of his precious granddaughters was bedded to a Stark, should fortunes change yet again. It was enough, for now, to stave off outright treachery. And so Robb marched north with fewer men than he would have liked, though he kept the families loyal to the Tullis and the other northern lords close. Jon and Roslin rode with him, part of his personal retinue. Catelyn Stark accompanied them as well, along with the great black direwolf, Grey Wind, who remained close to Robb's side. The crossing of the Neck proved arduous. Swamps and bogs made progress slow. Sickness began to spread among some of the soldiers. Robb pressed on, driven by the knowledge that the Ironborn had entrenched themselves at Moat Cailin. Every day the journey grew harsher, with biting insects, foul water, and the foreboding sense of being caught between the Lannisters' armies to the south and an uncertain road to the north. Jon caught Catelyn looking at him and Roslin with concern in her eyes, though she never quite voiced it. Roslin tried to hide her discomfort, but her cheeks were pale. She was not used to such harsh conditions, and though Jon did what he could to keep her comfortable, there was little relief to be found in the Neck. At last they reached Moat Cailin, the ancient fortress that once guarded the route into the north. Fallen towers and crumbling walls greeted them, the place half sunken in the bog, but still formidable enough when manned. The Ironborn had taken advantage of the tower's vantage points, raining arrows down on any who approached across the causeway. Robb ordered the siege to begin, though it was a slow, grinding affair. During one tense night, as the northern camp lay pitched a good distance from the fortress's arrow range, Jon heard the war horns of the Ironborn echo across the swamps. He rushed from his tent, sword in hand, Roslin clutching her cloak behind him. Across the dark water, fire flickered on the walls. He saw movement, the silhouettes of men brandishing spears. Robb's men scrambled into position, but the Ironborn did not sally out. They merely fired flaming arrows, a futile gesture in the damp air. It was a tactic meant to wear down morale, nothing more. As days turned to weeks, the siege dragged on. Robb tried negotiating with the Ironborn, promising them safe passage if they would surrender. Few believed the Ironborn would yield, but the bogs and disease took their toll on the Ironborn as well, and soon they were too weak to hold Moat Cailin effectively. One night, under a white flag, the Ironborn finally offered to depart if they were guaranteed safe passage to their ships. Robb, desperate to retake Moat Cailin with minimal losses, agreed. A hush fell over the camp as the ragged survivors were allowed to stumble out from behind the walls. True to his word, Robb let them depart into the swamps, albeit with only as many weapons as they could carry in a single small boat. The rest he confiscated. They vanished into the night, broken men, leaving Moat Cailin to the Starks. With Moat Cailin reclaimed, Robb finally secured a path to Winterfell and the northern heartlands. He pressed on, the men's spirits lifting at the prospect of returning home. Jon felt an odd mixture of anticipation and dread. He had not seen Winterfell since he joined the Night's Watch. So much had changed since then. Theon Greyjoy's betrayal had left Winterfell sacked and burned, though rumor said it had since been partially rebuilt by men loyal to the Starks. Could the old fortress even feel like home anymore? Roslin sensed his unease. She reached for his hand as they rode along a forested path north of the Neck. "You seem worried," she said softly. He nodded. "Winterfell was the only real home I ever knew, but I left it as a boy and I return now, a husband and a soldier in a war. I'm not sure I'll recognize it. I'm not sure it will recognize me." She squeezed his hand. "I'll be there with you." He gave her a small, grateful smile. That makes me glad." At last, the spires of Winterfell came into view, battered but still standing. The outer walls had been rebuilt where Theon's men had torn them down. A new wooden gate stood where the old had burned. Smoke rose from chimneys, a sign that people lived and worked here again. Seeing the familiar shapes of the Great Keep and the First Keep made Jon's heart clench. Memories flooded him. Running through the yard with Robb, sparring with wooden swords, stealing glances at Sansa practicing her stitches, or Arya flicking mud at Bran. And above all, the image of Lord Eddard Stark on the battlements, looking down at him with a reserved yet unmistakable paternal pride. Robb led them inside, greeted by the few remaining servants, all wearing House Stark's sigil. They bowed and curtsied, joy mingling with disbelief at the return of their liege lord, now king in the north. The castle was sparsely populated, but it was clear that the repairs had made it habitable once more. Roose Bolton had retreated south to Harrenhal, leaving the Bolton's men out of Winterfell, though a small contingent of Manderleys from White Harbor had arrived earlier to help fortify the castle. With the Starks' homecoming, fires were lit, great hunts were proposed, and a modest feast was arranged. Though the provisions in Winterfell were not plentiful, the castle's stewards did their best. Jon and Roslin were given chambers in the Great Keep. They walked through the ancient corridors, footsteps echoing. Roslin marveled at the hot springs that warmed the walls and the floors. She let out a small gasp as she placed a hand on one of the warm stones. "It's as if the castle itself breathes," she whispered in wonder. Jon nodded, unable to contain a flicker of pride. "That's the warmth of Winterfell, the gift of the hot springs. It's always been this way." As night fell, Robb convened his lords and advisors in the great hall. Grey Wind lay at his feet, tail flicking across the floor. Caitlin stood beside her son, her expression one of tired relief. Jon and Roslin joined them with several northern lords, Wyman Manderley, Galbart Glover, and others, gathered to pay respects and discuss the next steps in the war. A gloom settled over the gathering as they shared news. The Lannisters had regained strength, resecuring much of the Crownlands. Rumors spoke of Stannis Baratheon rallying in the north at the Wall to fight the wildling invasion. The Boltons, though nominally still loyal to the Starks, were rumored to be forging their own alliances in the background, with Roose Bolton wed now to Fatvalda Frey, further entangling the threads of family and alliance. Meanwhile, House Frey remained in the Riverlands, uncertain, their loyalty guaranteed only by the tenuous marriage of Jon to Roslin. Robb rose and declared that the north must be secured first. He would re-establish strongholds, rally the bannermen who might be wavering, and only then would he strike south again. A hush followed his words. No one argued. It was the pragmatic approach. War had taught them that cunning was as vital as valor. Jon felt relief. To stay in Winterfell to help rebuild it, that felt right. But he also worried about the tides of war and how swiftly they could turn. He caught a glance from Cailin, who seemed to sense the same. The north was vast, and the cost of defending it in a prolonged war against the Lannisters could be ruinous. Yet there was no easy solution. In the weeks that followed, Winterfell bustled with newfound energy. Builders repaired walls, blacksmiths forged weapons, huntsmen ranged into the wolfswood for game. Northern bannermen trickled in, swearing fealty to King Robb, though many brought dire reports of bandits or White Walkers rumored in the far north beyond the wall. Jon tried to set aside his old vow to the Night's Watch, but the memory of the others haunted him. He could not simply dismiss the threat they posed. Yet here he was, a husband and now a Stark in all but name, expected to fight for the North in a different way. Roslin adapted surprisingly well to Winterfell's rhythms. She spent time with the castle's women, learning the northern ways, how to preserve meats for the harsh winters, how to sew heavy cloaks lined with fur. She would sit by the hearth in the great hall, quietly listening to the stories of the old days, watching as the lords and their men came and went, all paying homage to the new queen in the north, Talisa, Robb's wife. Roslin seemed timid around Talisa at first, but Talisa's warm, approachable nature drew her out. On more than one occasion, Jon found his wife sitting with Talisa, talking softly, both of them sharing small laughter. He was relieved to see it. Roslin needed a friend here, far from her family. Night after night, Jon found himself unable to sleep, haunted by half-remembered dreams of the white wastes beyond the wall. Sometimes he dreamt of a weirwood tree with red leaves dripping blood, whispering secrets he could not understand. Other nights he dreamt of the crypts of Winterfell, where the dead Starks sat upon thrones of stone, calling him to join them. He would wake in a cold sweat, and Roslin would stir beside him, gently touching his shoulder, asking if he was ill. He would force a reassuring smile, but inside he felt more uncertain than ever. One day he went to the Godswood. The leaves of the ancient weirwood had turned red as embers. The face carved into the trunk looked sad, tears of sap running down its cheeks into the pool below. Jon knelt before the tree, resting a hand on the old roots. The breeze rustled the leaves, and he could almost hear a faint whisper in the air, or perhaps it was only in his mind. He thought of Ned Stark, of the promise he had made to always be a man of honor, to do what was right. He thought of the vow he had made to the Night's Watch, the vow he had broken. He asked the old gods for forgiveness or for a sign. None came, only the soft sigh of the wind. But when he rose to leave, he felt a measure of calmness settle over him. The old gods gave no easy answers, only the strength to face what was to come. When he returned to the courtyard, he found Catelyn Stark waiting for him, wrapped in a heavy cloak. She regarded him with an inscrutable look. "You are much changed from the boy who left for the wall," she said quietly. Jon inclined his head. "I suppose I am, my lady." He had never quite known how to address her comfortably. She was his father's wife, but had never been his mother. "I was unhappy when Robb proposed this marriage to the Freys," she continued. "I felt it was unfair, to you, to Roslin, to us all. But now, seeing you together, I cannot help but think we avoided a worse fate." Jon studied her face. Her eyes held sorrow. She had lost much in the war. Her husband, her youngest sons, Bran and Rickon, were still missing, presumed dead by many. Her daughters were hostages in King's Landing, or so she believed. "Perhaps," he said, not unkindly. "I can't say how events would have unfolded if Robb had kept his word and married a Frey daughter himself." Catelyn let out a weary sigh. "Walder Frey is not a forgiving man. Your marriage, I think, bought us all some measure of grace. For that I am grateful." She hesitated. "What do you hope for now, Jon?" He looked at her, surprised by the question. He thought for a moment, considering the swirl of responsibilities that weighed on him. "I hope to keep Roslin safe," he said at last. "I hope to help Robb win his war if he can. And part of me hopes to see the threat beyond the wall ended." The wildlings are the least of it, my lady. There are other things out there, things that can raise the dead. If they come south in force, this war of kings will mean little. A flicker of fear touched Caitlin's face. She had heard rumors of the White Walkers, the others, but she was a woman who trusted in steel and alliances. "May the gods preserve us," she whispered. "But if that threat is real, surely your brothers of the Night's Watch stand guard?" Jon almost laughed, but it was a humorless thought. "The Night's Watch is dwindling, my lady, and the wildlings gather under Mansraider. Soon they will come south in numbers never seen before. I wish I knew how best to help." She placed a hand on his arm, a gesture of understanding. "We will face that danger if it comes. For now, we must secure the north. The Lannisters, the Ironborn, the Boltons. There are too many dangers already on our doorstep." Jon nodded. "Yes, my lady." They parted ways. That evening, a modest feast was held in the great hall to welcome the newly arrived Karstarks. The hall was alive with conversation and the scent of roasted boar. Robb sat at the high table with Talisa, gray wind at his feet. Jon sat beside Roslin, who wore a pale gray gown trimmed with white fur, a subtle nod to House Stark. Cailin was on Robb's other side, while Lord Harrion Karstark addressed the king. As the feast went on, men drank and boasted of their exploits, exchanging tales of the battles fought in the Riverlands. Some praised the cunning of the Freys, others cursed them as turncloaks, but few dared speak ill of Jon openly, not with Robb nearby. Roslin listened quietly, cheeks flushing whenever someone mentioned the Freys. Jon squeezed her hand beneath the table, offering silent reassurance. A hush fell when Lord Karstark rose to speak. He was a tall, gaunt man, with the black hair characteristic of his line. He bowed to Robb. "Your Grace, I bring word from the east. My scouts report Boltons on the move near the Dreadfort. They do not appear to be marching here, but they are mustering men. And there are rumors that Roose Bolton has formed a secret pact with Tywin Lannister, though none can confirm it." The hall erupted in murmurs. Caitlin's face tightened, while Robb's eyes darkened. "If Roose Bolton has turned cloak, we must move swiftly," the king said, voice low and resolute. "Winterfell is still vulnerable. I cannot allow Bolton to approach from the east unchecked." "How many men can you muster, Lord Karstark?" asked Cailin, her tone controlled. Karstark scratched at his beard. 2,000 at most, your grace. Enough to mount a defense. But if Bolton has the strength of the Dreadfort behind him, we may be outnumbered." Robb's fists clenched on the table. "We will not allow traitors to remain within our ranks. But I must confirm these rumors before I declare Roose Bolton forsworn." Jon felt tension coil in his stomach. The Boltons were a dangerous house, famed for cruelty. Their symbol was the flayed man. If they had indeed allied with Tywin, then the North was in grave danger. After a moment's thought, Robb turned to Jon. "I need someone to go east to the Dreadfort and see if we can confirm Lord Karstark's rumors. It should be someone the Boltons won't immediately suspect. They know me, they know my main lords, but you're newly come from the Wall. Perhaps they'll think you are only a minor figure. Plus, your name is Snow, which might lull them into thinking you're less important." Jon exchanged a look with Roslin, who turned pale. He realized what this meant. He might be called away into danger, leaving her behind. He looked back at Robb, nodding slowly. "If it's your command, I'll go." "But what of Roslin?" Robb's voice softened. "She can remain here in Winterfell. We'll keep her safe. In truth, her presence here is a reminder of our alliance with the Freys, which might help quell any talk of them turning on us." Jon realized that leaving his wife in Winterfell was perhaps safer for her. He turned to Roslin and saw the fear in her eyes, though she tried to hide it. He clasped her hand. "I'll return," he said quietly. "No harm will come to you here." He believed it, or tried to. After all, this was Winterfell, the seat of House Stark. She nodded, swallowing hard. I will pray for your safe return." With that settled, Robb made the plans more concrete. Jon would ride east with a small band of men loyal only to the Starks, men whose names the Boltons would not easily recognize. They would travel under the guise of delivering messages to White Harbor, perhaps, and then see if they could gain entry to the Dreadfort. Jon did not relish the idea of subterfuge, but he could see no other way. The next morning, he said his farewells to Roslin. She stood by the gate, her eyes brimming with unspoken worry. He gently touched her cheek, feeling the warmth of her skin against the chill morning air. "Trust in Robb. And in Winterfell," he said. "I'll come back." She lifted her chin, trying to be brave. "I will be waiting, my lord." Her lips quivered, but she managed a small smile. "Please be safe." Jon kissed her forehead, then mounted his horse, leading the small troop out of Winterfell's gates. He cast one final look over his shoulder, seeing Roslin's cloak flutter in the icy breeze as she stood watching. Then he spurred his horse forward, unsure of what fate lay ahead. The journey east was harsh. They skirted the Wolfswood, passing small villages where the sight of armed men caused shutters to slam. The north was weary of war, suspicious of strangers. Jon kept his men to out-of-the-way paths, mindful that the Dreadfort scouts might be everywhere. The snows had not yet fully come, but there was a biting chill in the air. Each night, they camped in silence, eating meager rations. Jon found himself haunted by thoughts of Roslin. He had grown used to her presence, her quiet companionship. Now, in the dark of night, he felt her absence keenly. He told himself it was just worry for a woman who was thrust into his life, but somewhere deeper he felt it was more. She had become his wife in truth as well as in name. He found he cared for her well-being, her gentle heart, her trembling courage. Finally, they glimpsed the distant silhouette of the Dreadfort. It rose from the rugged landscape like a menacing shadow, flanked by high walls of pale stone. The flayed man banner flew from its ramparts. Jon suppressed a shudder, recalling the stories of House Bolton's cruelties in ages past. This was not a place known for warmth or mercy. He gave orders for his men to set up a small camp near a bend in the river, out of sight of the castle. He would approach the gates with only one companion, a man named Garrick who had served as a messenger for House Stark. Their story would be simple. They carried tidings from King Robb to White Harbor and wished to break their journey with the Boltons, as the northern roads were treacherous. It was a flimsy story, but might suffice to gain entry. Approaching the gates at dusk, Jon saw guards in pale leather bearing the sigil of the flayed man. Their eyes narrowed at the sight of strangers. "Halt!" one commanded. "What business do you have at the Dreadfort?" Jon lifted his head, controlling his nerves. "We ride from Winterfell on the king's business, but the roads are treacherous at night. We seek shelter." The guard spat on the ground, eyeing them. "King's business, you say? I see no banner of the wolf." "We keep our banners hidden, lest bandits see them and grow bold," Jon replied evenly. "We have no quarrel with House Bolton. We only ask for a night's rest. Then we'll be on our way." The guards muttered among themselves, uncertain. Finally, the portcullis rose and they were admitted. Inside the courtyard, men of House Bolton surrounded them, silent and watchful. The Dreadfort's walls loomed overhead, the windows dark like empty eyes. Jon's heart pounded. This place felt wrong, a place where cruelty was second nature. A steward emerged, tall and thin, beckoning them forward. "The Lord is away, but you may speak with his castellan. Follow me." They dismounted, leaving their horses to the stable boys, who eyed them sullenly. As they were led through the Dreadfort's corridors, Jon noticed flayed skins stretched on frames, half hidden by shadows, remnants of the Boltons' darkest traditions. He forced himself not to stare. They came to a dimly lit hall, where a stern-faced man sat at a small table, looking over documents by candlelight. He wore the sigil of House Bolton on his doublet, and a ring of keys jangled at his side. He did not rise when Jon and Garrick entered. "What do you want?" he said flatly. Jon held his composure. "We come seeking shelter for the night. We travel to White Harbor on King Robb's business." The castellan's gaze flicked up, cold and searching. "King Robb's business, is it?" The Dreadfort is loyal to the king in the north. That is true. He paused. You are the bastard Jon Snow, are you not? Jon's pulse jumped. He had hoped to pass unnoticed, but apparently not. I am. Did you receive word of my marriage alliance with House Frey? A sneer curled the castellan's lip. We have heard rumors. So the king in the north weds his bastard brother to a Frey, and in turn expects the Boltons to remain loyal. He let out a contemptuous sniff. Well, we offer no harm to travelers who call upon our gates for shelter, unless you give us cause. Jon inclined his head. We give no cause, only thanks for your hospitality. The castellan eyed them for a moment longer, then snapped his fingers at a servant. See that they are given quarters in the tower. Minimal comforts. I'll speak with them come morning. With that, Jon and Garrick were dismissed. They were led to a cramped chamber with a single small window and 2 straw pallets. A single torch on the wall provided flickering light. Once alone, Garrick let out a breath. He knows who you are. That can't be good. Jon nodded grimly, scanning the chamber for any sign of listening holes. The Dreadfort was rumored to be riddled with spy passages. We'll have to be cautious. Listen for any hints of betrayal. If the Boltons have turned their cloaks, we need proof to bring back to Robb. Garrick grunted. Let's just make sure we can get out alive. That night, sleep was fitful. Jon dreamt of flayed men walking the halls, whispering secrets in voices that sounded like wind over ice. In his dream, he ran, searching for Roslin, but found only corridors that twisted endlessly into darkness. When he awoke, covered in cold sweat, dawn's gray light seeped through the tiny window. Garrick still slept, snoring softly. Jon stood and stretched, peering out the window. The courtyard below was stirred to life. Men saddling horses, carrying crates. Could Bolton's men be preparing to march somewhere? He dressed quickly, deciding to explore. If they were barred from leaving, that would be all the proof he needed of treachery. Garrick woke, and they ventured down to the courtyard together. Guards watched them, but did not stop them from wandering. They approached a stable hand, feigning casual curiosity. Looks busy this morning, Jon said. Where are all these supplies headed? The stable hand shrugged, glancing around nervously. The Lord's orders. We're to send men with wagons south, but I'm not sure where. Heard them mention the twins, but who knows? The twins? Jon's stomach twisted. If Bolton's men were heading to the twins, it might be innocent, or it might be something else. Did Roose Bolton plan to meet with Walder Frey, or with Tywin Lannister's forces? The war had taught Jon that not everything was as it seemed, and Walder Frey might decide that a better alliance could be made with the Lannisters. The memory of the uneasy wedding feast at the twins lingered in Jon's mind. As they moved to the far side of the courtyard, they noticed a row of supply wagons loaded with barrels and crates. Jon edged closer, trying to see if any of it might hint at the cargo within. He glimpsed swords, spears, far more weapons than one would expect for a simple supply run. A guard barked a warning at them, and Jon hastily moved away. They spent the rest of the day in uneasy waiting, speaking little to the castellan, who seemed intent on ignoring them until he could find a reason not to. By evening, it was clear that a large contingent of Bolton men was preparing to leave at first light. Jon made the decision. They had to slip out in the night if possible, to bring word to Robb that something was afoot. Maybe the Boltons were still allied, but the notion of them sending a war party south was too suspicious. Under cover of darkness, Jon and Garrick gathered their gear. Leaving the Dreadfort unseen would not be easy. Guards patrolled the walls and the courtyard. But the keep was large, and not all corners were well lit. Under pretenses of stepping outside for some air, they managed to slip into a side passage. Using the gloom to their advantage, they crept along the stables, where their horses were kept. Luck was with them. The stable was empty but for a couple of sleeping grooms. Jon and Garrick found their horses in separate stalls, saddled them as quietly as they could. Just as they led the animals toward the stable door, a guard appeared in the doorway, torch in hand. Oi! You lot, what are you doing? Jon froze, then forced a smile. We've decided we can't stay any longer, he said. "The roads are calling." The guard narrowed his eyes. "The castellan said you were to remain until morning. We have orders." Garrick moved swiftly, clamping a hand over the guard's mouth, muffling his shout, while Jon struck him at the temple with the hilt of his sword. The guard crumpled. They waited, hearts pounding, but no alarm was raised. Quickly, they led the horses out into the courtyard. 2 more guards stood by the main gate, which was shut. One was drowsing, leaning on his spear. The other blinked in surprise as he saw Jon and Garrick approach. Jon had no choice but to brandish his sword. "Open the gate," he said in a hushed but firm tone. "We mean to leave." The guard's eyes flicked to the sleeping guard beside him, but he hesitated to call out. Perhaps he sensed that a shout would earn him a blade in the gut. He slowly reached for the wheel that controlled the gate's iron mechanism. Garrick stood watch, scanning the walls. The guard began to turn the wheel, the chains clanking. The portcullis rose inches from the ground. Then a shout rang out from behind them. More guards had discovered the unconscious man in the stable. Jon wheeled around. "Garrick, go!" He slapped his horse's flank, spurring the animal forward as the gate rose just enough to pass. Garrick ducked beneath and vanished into the night. Jon swung onto his horse, ignoring the startled guard's protests. He kicked his mount hard, racing for the gate just as the guard desperately tried to reverse the wheel. Crossbow bolts thudded into the ground around him. One grazed his horse's flank, causing the animal to rear and neigh in pain, but Jon spurred it onward. The gate was closing. He leaned forward, clinging to the horse's mane, urging it to jump. It was a tight squeeze, but the horse galloped through the shrinking gap, throwing Jon's weight forward. He emerged into the cold night air outside, hoofs pounding on the dirt path. Behind him, shouts filled the air, men calling for hounds, for crossbows. Bolts flew past in the darkness, but it was too late for them to aim properly. Jon pressed on, catching up with Garrick. Together, they fled at a hard gallop away from the Dreadfort, the chill wind biting at their faces. They did not stop until they reached the small camp they had set up with the rest of their men. It was near midnight by then, the moon high. Their companions had heard the distant shouts and scrambled to mount up. Jon wasted no time. "We ride south," he said breathlessly. "We can't go back the way we came. They'll expect that. We must circle around, return to Winterfell through the hills." No one argued. They broke camp in haste, riding away into the darkness, leaving the Dreadfort far behind, its torches gleaming like hateful eyes in the distance. Jon's mind spun with questions. Bolton men heading south, the suspicious supply of weapons. This could only mean treachery was in the works. Possibly a meeting with Tywin or a new plan to undermine Robb. He had to warn his brother. The ride back to Winterfell took days. They avoided main roads, rationed their food, and kept a keen eye out for Bolton scouts. Twice they spotted riders in the distance, but Jon led them off the path, waiting until the scouts passed. Finally, battered and exhausted, they arrived at Winterfell's gates. The men on watch recognized Jon immediately, raising cheers as he passed. He demanded an immediate audience with Robb, who was in the Great Hall, conferring with lords. The moment Jon entered, muddy and unkempt, Roslin sprang to her feet from where she'd been standing near Talisa. Relief washed over her face at the sight of him alive. Robb met Jon halfway down the hall, gray wind at his side. "Jon," he said, voice tense, "what did you discover?" Jon glanced at the lords, all eyes upon him. "We found the Dreadfort mustering men and supplies, likely heading south under cover of night. My guess is that Roose Bolton means to join forces with someone. I fear it might be the Lannisters or even Walder Frey." A murmur of alarm spread through the assembled lords. Roslin paled at the mention of her family's name. Robb's expression hardened. "Then we must assume betrayal is imminent. I won't let Bolton or Frey catch us unawares." He turned to his advisors, speaking in a firm tone. "Send ravens to all our bannermen. The traitors will expect us to remain idle. We must show them the North is not so easily broken." If we move quickly, we can intercept the Boltons before they reach the twins, or wherever they're heading. We'll march at first light." The lords saluted, though their faces showed worry. War was coming to the north, a new front in an already bloody conflict. As they dispersed to carry out the orders, Roslin rushed forward, almost hesitant to embrace Jon in front of everyone. But she placed a trembling hand on his arm. He covered her hand with his own. "I'm safe," he whispered, letting his eyes meet hers. "I came back." She nodded, eyes brimming with tears of relief. "I prayed for you every day," she murmured. He smiled, drawing her into a gentle hug, not caring who saw. In that moment, he felt the warmth of her presence drive away the cold dread that the Dreadfort had left in him. But beyond their embrace, the shadows of war lengthened once more. The fragile alliance that had kept House Stark afloat was fraying. Walder Frey's next move was uncertain. Roose Bolton was on the march, and the Lannisters still lurked to the south. But at least the Red Wedding had been averted. Here stood Jon Snow, newly returned, one small thread binding House Frey to House Stark. He did not know if it would be enough to halt the coming storm. Yet for now, in that brief respite, he let himself cling to Roslin, hoping that their union might prove a bulwark against the treacheries of the realm. He silently vowed that no matter what came next, he would protect his brother, his wife, and the North itself, whatever the cost.